Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Rights Studies. We're pleased today to have another interview as part of our project with the OSCE's Office for Media Freedom. And that is to look at the AI and COVID Disinformation Initiative, to look at how COVID disinformation is impacting freedom of expression and looking at the role of AI in all of this, both for dealing with misinformation, but also generating misinformation. So today, I'm very pleased to have Eline Chivot. Eline is the digital policy, senior advisor on digital policy at the European People's Party. Eline, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. It's a pleasure.
So, Eline, maybe just to start, if you could maybe tell us about some of your work and how you see things from your role right now. Is how do you see digital disinformation related to COVID?
Well, it's a huge topic. Obviously, there's been an increasing number of fake news about the COVID outbreak circulating online. It's a massive wave. But it's also not just been about content. We often talk about content, but it's also about goods. The number of fake medicines, disinfection sprays, miracle cures sold online was truly staggering. Regarding some trends on content, it's interesting to look at what it was like 12 months ago versus today. The messages have changed. We see that they've become even more political. There are less conspiracy theories about where the virus comes from, but more, at the time it was more about that, right? That it was a military bioweapon, that it will, this sort of things. Another worrying trend is that the COVID crisis will have definitely revived the anti-vax community, and it's gained a much wider audience, you could say. Now, we can always go a bit more into detail about the types of fake content. You had the causes and the origins of the pandemic, then you had bogus cures and medical treatments for virus, like garlic or vitamin C. And then you had the instrumental use of the virus to push secret agendas. And then, now I mentioned the narratives have evolved. Last spring, it was all about where the virus came from and who was to blame. And 12 months in the pandemic, COVID disinformation has become more sophisticated, tapping into well-entrenched online communities that share misinformation across borders and weaponize falsehoods for political gains, which are now focusing on the vaccine rollout in Western countries. Now that vaccination programs, are taking roots all over the world, you have narratives focusing on about how these injections could harm people's health. Can I just add a big challenge is that now you have, as mentioned, more anti-vax groups and far-right activists. They're increasingly coordinating their messages. That's something we observe often across borders. They've created new digital relationships, which are likely to proliferate further, after the pandemic. And the perpetrators of false information have become just smarter. They know how to game the system, and the speed at which their narratives travel has only it's only accelerated during the crisis. And it's so difficult to tackle. All of this continues to get through the checks and efforts deployed by platforms and governments, obviously damaging healthcare, public health, and also, more broadly, damaging trust in the institutions, in our governments, and in democracies, eroding confidence in public health measures and jeopardizing their effectiveness. So it's not a very rosy picture.
Well, it's very similar to Canada. And this weekend, we had a 5,000 person march in downtown Montreal with the same messages that you're mentioning. So this is an international issue and many similarities. I'm wondering when we look at dealing with this, at least the online space, and I'm wondering if you could tell us, is there a role for artificial intelligence in countering disinformation?
You mean if we can use AI to address those issues?
Yeah, to address some of it. If it has a role, if it's a tool used, or if you're seeing this as a discussion point in Europe.
Yeah, so I would definitely that you can, the technology is there to help us. Generally, using algorithms can accelerate the fact-checking process, the debunking process. If you only rely on human content moderation, that would be just impossible because of the thousands and millions of photos or content being uploaded every day to platforms, right? You have automated filters that can recognize some content with really great accuracy, like that's especially true for terrorist propaganda. You can also tweak, algorithms to increase the quality of the news in the ranking of search results. You can use it to avoid the reinforcement of search around conspiracy theories. You can use them to reject violent content or verify the origin of a piece of information. So it's really a good first line of defense against disinformation and harmful content. Now, social media networks and platforms have used those kind of tweaking strategies to limit the reach of disinformation online, and have really worked with national government to highlight, for instance, using technology to highlight mainstream medical advice about the pandemic. They've removed millions of pieces of COVID disinformation. They've banned billions, I think, if I'm not mistaken, of fake accounts. And that's just not about COVID. That's ongoing work all the time, obviously. Now, despite just one thing that I've recently read is that despite those, there's been a lot of high-profile calls to use AI to combat COVID-19. Actually, the technology was barely used for that purpose, according to some research, I think, which was from the UK's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So yeah, there's a lot of potential with AI. Now there's, of course, another side of the story, which maybe we'll get to talk about.
So interesting. So with the use of AI to combat digital disinformation, that really falls to the roles of the private sector. But I'm wondering if you've seen anything that jumps to you that are kind of legislative measures or policies put forward by governments or by civil society actors that is something that we really need to kind of maybe see emulate across countries or in other regions of the world.
So something that we are seeing or something that they should do?
It could be either or. Either something that I know Europe has advanced with legislation on some of the of content moderation and platform governance, but there's perhaps some other big ideas that are coming out of Europe that we're not aware of in North America.
Yeah, so like one thing I wanted to mention is that one reason some governments and civil society and platforms need to take even more action is because actually the technology is not enough to deal with disinformation, right? So automated content moderation and analysis is not enough. The technology is not a silver bullet. It does not understand all types of content, like nuance or sarcasm. So it's a delicate balancing act, and sometimes that results in unintended errors. It can be counterproductive. Even AI can, even reinforce some patterns of information spreading. It's sort of, algorithms value engagement. So, like comments, shares, and clicks. So, with echo chambers and filter bubbles, you have some sort of a greater exposure of users to certain news that we agree or disagree with. And there's this reinforcement phenomenon that can drive confirmation biases and information blindness. So I think it is important to mention that, the technology is not enough, and so is human oversight. I mean, you could turn fact checkers into science newsrooms like they did to contextualize information. But it's, even then, content moderation efforts they're scaling up, but they are still sometimes too slow and too inefficient. So back to what, sorry?
No, I was going to say it was very interesting how you talked about how in some cases AI or the algorithms on platforms can play a role in spreading misinformation, or at least in making creating these filter bubbles and creating these echo chambers where people lose their critical skills to be able to question what they're reading.
Yeah, that's definitely something that stands in the way, right? I mean, we are both, I wouldn't say we're victims, but we're users. And this is also what we're looking for, right? We use social media for the engagement, and we are spending our time online to get to that type of content. So there is an encouragement as well. It's a two-way kind of process, and you cannot filter everything out. So yeah, that's kind of the pros and cons. This is really a how do you call that? A two-sided sword, a two-edged sword. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Right. Thank you. I couldn't quite find the term anymore. Yeah.
Um,
And I still wanted to address your question. I apologize for jumping back to the. If I may still answer your question about what has been done, especially EU level. If that's okay, if I can still answer that question.
but please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Because there's also a lot to say there. Obviously, you have countries already focusing regulatory efforts on the engineering and design side. I think France, for instance, appointed an algorithm auditor to oversee the effects of platform engineering on the French public. The UK proposed that companies assess the impact of algorithms on illegal content distribution and illegal activity on their platforms. And the EU as a whole has been headed in that direction too. I think since 2018, especially because, in the context of the elections happening in 2019 and what's happened with Brexit and the US elections, there was really a wake-up call. And one of the calls included asking platforms to publicly explain how they make decisions, on which criteria are used, how are they measured, are those decisions made by an algorithm or is human moderation applied? The Commissioner Vera Jourova, recently asked for platforms maybe to act like architects, the way architects need to respect some sort of code to build buildings and a number of safety legislation. So they would like to see something similar for the digital world with a mix of, say, legal, ethical, societal norm that would ensure continuing trust in the internet. And one piece of legislation that I can briefly tell you about is the Digital Services Act. It's a new legislation that will basically, in part, tackle disinformation, but not exactly. It's mostly about illegal content. So it's not about directly tackling misinformation, but it will play a big role in setting up some sort of a mechanism to facilitate collaborative research between industry and academia, because researchers need access to data, to sort of check algorithms, understand how they work. Transparency is very much required now and really demanded to platforms. And so this is a really important part of those steps. And the DSA will not regulate disinformation per se, but there are transparency rules that will stem from that proposal, which will likely create preconditions for further policy measures and intervention strategies to fight disinformation. Another very important type of, it's not really a legislation, but it's called the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And this is quite an important step that the EU has taken, and it's actually pretty unique. It's basically some sort of an agreement between platforms, the largest platforms, with EU policymakers. And that's been launched in 2018. And right now the Commission is preparing an updated code of practice. I know that it's been mixed success. I mean, it helped to through this code, we were able to see platforms reporting on how they're exploring solutions, what was missing. It actually pushed them to roll out various changes, really to put it very briefly. But a lot of stakeholders are asking for a stricter approach, especially trade associations, universities, NGOs, civil society want to see more performance indicators to make sure enforcement is guaranteed, that there's more obligations to share certain types of data with researchers, that there's more transparency, especially on political ads. So there's still a lot of discussions on how to improve this code of practice, but it's been quite an interesting and a very first of its kind self-regulatory or co-regulatory sort of tool, which has led to the creation as well of a lot of partnerships between industry platforms and civil society and universities. So a lot has moved in that space, including because of the code of practice, I think.
Fascinating. Our government's about to put in place legislation to regulate the social media giants and online harms, disinformation, online hate. And I know what's happening in Europe is we're looking at as models and seeing what can be done. So it's fascinating that you mentioned that, and I think we need to understand it more. I maybe have one more question for you, Eline. You talked about a double-edged sword, and so there's a negative aspect that if one tries to deal with online disinformation and goes too strongly, it can have a negative impact on certain fundamental human rights, including freedom of expression. I'm wondering if you could comment on what can governments do or should consider when trying to tackle digital disinformation around COVID, but guarantee and protect that fundamental human right, freedom of expression online?
It's a very sensitive question, and I mean, even within our own, political groups or bubbles of stakeholders, there's a lot of disagreement. I'm not even sure it's partisan. It's a partisan type conversation. One really critical aspect of what we're talking about here is really, I think, about the division of roles and responsibilities between the private and the public sector and the impact that can have on freedom of speech through censorship by one or the other in particular. On our end, you probably have seen how some policymakers criticize the move of platforms over Trump's activity on social media back in January. Even here in Europe, we had policymakers asking companies a while ago to regulate themselves and to take action, which meant outsourcing the difficult decisions to them. But now, because of what happened, a lot of them are saying, we want to regulate platforms precisely because of what happened, because platforms took action, and that's not okay. And that's a difficult conversation because you don't want to fall into the trap of seeking to impose truth through government authorities or private entities either, but rather, through the means of the free exchange of ideas and arguments. And if you ask platforms and their industry, at least what I hear they say is that they don't want to be in this position of being arbiters of the truth. It's true that they're constantly changing their rules, and it is making a decision when you are not enforcing against certain behavior, and so you might amplify it anyway. So they are ultimately making a decision. So just to really answer your question as best I can, private companies could be seen as independent in determining their own policies. And arguably, why not, as long as their terms are compliant with the law. There is a thin line, maybe like a gray area, but say if online liability amounts to holding companies responsible based on whether or not, a platform has correctly predicted a government's agreement or disagreement with a decision, that could be problematic, because if that's the basis on which companies may be held accountable, you'd have companies behaving so cautiously that they may be taking down lawful content. And if you have that happening, if governments have such kind of power in some countries where the rule of law is weak, that could be an issue, right? So I think you want to have, I think the state really wants to be back in the game of controlling some of what's going on, because a lot of that is unacceptable, and you want to have platforms being held accountable more. But it's really a thin line of the roles and responsibilities. Another example I can give you is whether or not platforms should use technology, again, to moderate their content. And a lot of voices are saying you should not mandate the use of technologies because they are not perfect, those technologies. Not all platforms could afford them either. And also because you might be at risk of not taking measures through the technology that the behavior that will be a consequence of those rules could be that platforms would just err on the side of censorship, just to make sure that they're not, that nothing wrong is published on their platform. So these are my thoughts on this. And finally, freedom of speech, it's just, again, back to the Washington-Brussels discussion in January. Freedom of speech in the US doesn't mean the same in the EU. And within the EU, across member states, you have different understanding, different histories, different rules about what is illegal or not, or what is offensive or not. So I think it's a very, very difficult topic you've chosen to ask me questions about today.
Well, Eline, I want to thank you you gave a comprehensive overview of the policy issues, the ethical issues, and the challenges for both tech companies and governments try to regulate this. And you're right. Every country is different. The US has its view on free speech and freedom of expression is very different than other Western democracies. But I just want to say it was a pleasure to talk to Eline Chivot, a senior advisor on digital policy at the European People's Party. Eline, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kyle.